Welcome to Groundwater Rising. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we're a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Katie Hargrave-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast I will be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation and strategies from the water sector, academia and beyond. According to government data, 35% of households in the UK are rented accommodation. With flood risk on the rise, the Environment Agency warns that by 2050, 1 in 4 households could be at risk of flooding. In previous episodes, we've explored how to protect your home from flooding and the importance of flood insurance. But what if you're renting and don't have full control over the property's flood resilience measures? What are your responsibilities as a tenant when it comes to flooding? And just as importantly, what rights and expectations should you have of your landlord? Joining me today are Craig Glynn and Mary Long-Dhonau. Craig is the Chief Executive Officer at Citizens Advice Bucks. Mary, or Flood Mary as she is more commonly known, has 25 years experience in supporting and advising victims of flooding during their recovery. She uses her own experience of flooding to act as an advocate for others and runs her own consultancy, floodmary.com, specialising in property flood resilience. So, Mary, just based on the experience that you have working with flood victims, have you worked with many who experience flooding in rented accommodation, and are there distinct challenges with that?
Yes, Katie, I have. Over the last 2 winters, I have travelled into many flooded communities, and I've talked to about 2,000 newly flooded people, and they're all reeling from the experience of being flooded. Of course, I've talked to many renters. Now, I find sort of a different response from landlords. Some of the landlords are absolutely excellent and couldn't be better and couldn't offer more support. And also, there are many landlords that basically don't care, don't give a fig and don't offer support at all, leaving people absolutely stuck as to how they can move forward. And I've talked to many renters who are still living in flooded homes.
And Craig, so is that sort of what should be happening when someone's renting and there's a flood?
If someone were to be the victim of flooding, there are a general set of principles the landlord has to follow. So that would be maintenance of the structure of the property. So that could be things like walls, roofs, windows and doors, all things key in a flooding situation. But it extends to things like sinks, baths, toilets, pipes and wiring, heating, boilers and all the rest of it. So when you are experiencing flooding in rented property, the same responsibilities carry over. So they are unlikely, though, to be responsible if you've caused the flooding yourself. But obviously in these kinds of situations, that's not what we're talking about. So in the case of groundwater flooding in rented accommodation, the responsibility would be fixing damage to the structure of your home, but also then making sure your water, gas, electricity, sanitation and heating are in operation as well.
How about during a flood? So when the flood's happening, what should the landlord be doing at that point?
So really for a landlord, the key here is they are not obligated to do anything until they are informed by the tenant. So any people in rented accommodation who are subject to flooding at the moment, the best thing that you can do is make contact with your landlord as early as possible. Because at that point, it kicks in their obligation to do repairs and to help support the property. That can include, for example, helping you find alternative accommodation. So if you're with a housing association or with the council, they have an obligation to help you find alternative accommodation on a temporary basis. If you're in a private rented property, however, it may be stipulated in your tenancy agreement that they are obligated to do the same thing, but you will have to check your tenancy agreement because that is subject to the specifics of what's in your contract. And if you are finding that that isn't in your specific tenancy agreement, the obligation then falls on yourself to find alternative accommodation if that's what's needed at the time.
So should you still be paying for a house that's currently being flooded and might be unlivable at that point?
You may need to move out. You don't have to move out. If you can get safely from room to room while repairs are being done, you don't actually have to leave the property, but what you can negotiate with your landlord for is a temporary reduction in the amount of rent you're paying, because obviously you don't have full access to the property that you're paying for, so you shouldn't really be having to pay the full extent of the rent. And your landlord, whilst this is going on, is legally responsible for protecting you and your belongings as well, which is a key feature. If, however, the property is so badly damaged that you would need to move out on a temporary basis, it's different. If you live in a council or housing association property, they should find you somewhere else to live. But if you're not, you'll have to find that yourself. Do not, under any circumstances, move out until you've told your landlord why you're doing so. And in a lot of instances, your landlord should have confirmed with you that the terms of your tenancy agreement will stay the same when you move back in as they were before you left. And lastly, your landlord should give you an estimate on how long the repairs are going to take. So when it comes to the specifics of paying, it's different depending on your circumstances. So you can ask your landlord to suspend the rent payments of the home that you've moved out of, or you can ask them to pay for the temporary accommodation that you're living in and continue to pay your rent. But the most important thing for us to emphasise when we talk to clients is that you never cease paying your rent without having a conversation with the landlord first, because you can get yourself into a whole nest of trouble going down that route. And there are also some complications and considerations you would want to have if you're receipt of any welfare benefits. So if you're on universal credit, or if you're receiving housing benefit, the legacy version, you need to make sure that you're notifying the Department of Work and Pensions. You can do that via your universal credit journal. On there you can notify your work coach that you have this change of circumstances, because if you don't, you could be receiving benefits that you're temporarily not entitled to, and you can believe the Department of Work and Pensions will come after you for those as a form of overpayment, which again is a level of trouble that you'd want to avoid, particularly when you're dealing with the emotional and other trauma of having a flooded home.
It feels like something, maybe, Mary, that you would advise people think about beforehand in a flood plan, how they would handle it in renting.
Oh, absolutely. A flood plan, or as I'm reframing it now, a flood to-do list, because everybody these days has a to-do list. So I've got a flood to-do list on my website, and really it's no different to if you owned your own home, really, that you sign up for Environment Agency flood warnings or Met Office severe weather warnings, or both. And then that you plan in advance what you're going to do if you should flood. For instance, moving your car as well as your belongings, because so many people I've talked to over the last 2 winters haven't moved their car and have got a flooded house and a flooded car, and they can be brought to their knees. And it's really going through your home before a flood and writing down what means most to you and what you can move. Now, this doesn't have to cost any money. On your list, write down things like Granny's photograph that you've only got a hard copy for, and get a load of plastic boxes and put everything in it. My husband would freak out if he lost his vinyls. So in the plastic box they would go. And I'd be upset if I lost the little handprints of my grandchildren and all their photographs that I've been given. So in the plastic box they would go, and they would go upstairs and always have a designated room, so you know where you're going to put things. It might mean that you've got to pair up the kids or something, but far better that than lose all your stuff. And I say that really passionately, because when I was first flooded, I lost my memories, and I lost all the little handprints of my children, their first nursery pictures, their hospital memorabilia, everything that I was saving to give them on their 18th birthday, all thrown into the skip. And that, to this day, still upsets me. So really, first of all, your sentimental items, your passport, your insurance document, your birth certificate, all upstairs. Now, if you live in a bungalow, on your to-do list, have a neighbour that doesn't flood or a relative that doesn't flood. Ring them up and have them come round and collect all those items and take them away, if you're not strong enough to get things on top of high shelves and on top of your wardrobes. So there's always a way round things. And it's always important to prepare your own home for flooding as well, where it doesn't cost a lot of money. Those plastic boxes are brilliant, but putting things like a couple of old Wellington boots and a plastic bucket and a plastic bin on table legs that will enable you to put your stuff on top of. And also, if you've got things like decorators' trestles that you can lift your sofa up onto. And also, I've got a YouTube film that you can look at, and it shows you how, if you live alone, how using a few planks of wood and some bricks, how you can easily lift your furniture. So if you've got all that in your to-do list, then you're better prepared for flooding, and you don't have the heartbreak of losing things that mean an awful lot to you. And then, if you haven't got property flood resilience products, I swear by aluminium tape. And you can buy it from any DIY store or Screwfix or something like that, and put it over your air bricks, because a lot of properties have a lot of air bricks. Now, I know the maths and I try to simplify things always, but if you imagine a builder's rubble sack full of water, now 5 of those every hour can get into your home via one air brick, causing an awful lot of damage. So having your air bricks covered, and groundwater flooding, of course, it can rise up and it will go through the lowest point, which will be your air bricks. And you can also use aluminium tape in a hurry. It's not as good as property flood resilience measures, but up your door and along the bottom of it and up the other side to about 0.6 of a metre. And that will certainly slow down the ingress of any flood water that could come through your door.
It's this idea of, if you just pre-plan, there is a lot of things you can do quite cheaply to be ready that will massively reduce the impact on you. But then I guess one of the differences that I always think about when it comes to being flooded in rental versus being flooded when you own the home is, often when you buy a home, there is a survey, and that survey will say this property has been flooded before. I think people who are selling have a legal responsibility to share if the property has been flooded, and surveys will look at the flood risk. But you don't do surveys when it comes to rented. I do not believe. I definitely haven't. I'm very lucky that, because I work in a flood risk team, when I said I was moving, my colleague and friend immediately looked up all the places I was looking at and said which one was at flood risk and which wasn't. But that's not the norm. So I'm assuming, Craig, am I right in saying there's no legal obligation of landlords to tell you if you're going to be moving into a flood risk area?
I believe there isn't. So the obligations on landlords around things like gas safety certificates and electrical inspections, but they don't extend in this direction. I think if you inform your landlord of the kind of measures that Mary was just talking about, it can form part of their obligation to ensure the structure and safety of the property. Citizens' advice doesn't hold that kind of information around what you can do to protect your home, so we definitely endorse, whether you're a homeowner or a renter, checking out Mary's website and following those tips and simply starting that conversation with your landlord.
Another thing you can do, Katie, of course, is even if you're a renter, as you've said, your colleagues checked for you, you can put "what is my flood risk" just into Google, those words, and it will take you to the Environment Agency's website. You can put in a list of postcodes for the properties you're considering renting and find out their flood risk. And then when you've actually chosen one of them, if it is at flood risk, then you can sign up for free Environment Agency flood warnings.
And as I said at the beginning, 1 in 4 properties are due potentially to be at risk by 2050. So it is really worth considering that, because not knowing, I think, leads to so much more devastation, because you can't do those simple things to prepare. So Mary, can you give a quick definition of property flood resilience? Because we talk about it a lot, but for anyone who doesn't know what those specific words mean.
Well, certainly, property flood resilience isn't just about products. It's knowing your flood risk, planning to flood, so signing up for that free warning, Environment Agency warning, having your to-do list ready, a flood to-do list, so that's part of property flood resilience as well. Because trust me, if you get a flood warning and you haven't got a to-do list, your mind turns to spaghetti and you can go into sort of panic mode. But having something that's written down means you can go systematically through what you've written and do things in the order that you think is most important. So those three things are all part of property flood resilience. Then we talk about the products, the measures, the things that you can use to reduce your flood risk at a home level. So flood doors, for instance, flood barriers, self-closing air bricks, non-return valve, because lots of properties flood through sewage up through their toilets, and even groundwater flooding, sump pumps. And everybody along the River Severn near where I live swears by a puddle pump, which is something you can sit on the floor and chuck a hose pipe, attach the hose pipe to it, chuck it out of the window, and if you get a nice big strong one, that can keep flood water down to about 1 mil. So it can reduce the actual impact of a flood. And then the last bit, there's two more components of property flood resilience. One is using recoverable measures to help a house, if it does flood, to recover very quickly. Things like waterproof plaster and solid floors with tiles on with waterproof gratin adhesive. And even you can get wonderful, beautiful looking recyclable plastic kitchens that can be flooded, washed down and sanitised. And then if we go one step further as well, greening up your garden is such a big part, especially with surface water flooding, but part of sort of property flood resilience. And now I've got a lovely case study from Hull, where when the floods happened there in 2007, we might all remember that 55,000 properties were flooded in 2007, and Hull was one of the worst affected areas. There was a street of terraced houses, and every property but one flooded. And this one house was in the middle, either side of them flooded, but he hadn't got hard paving, he'd got grass in the front garden, and he'd greened up his back garden. So all that is part of property flood resilience. It's not just one thing, it's the whole gambit of flood resilience.
So if you move into a house and you've got a paved garden, like a paved front, do you recommend talking to the landlord if you know that it's at risk? Is that something that could be covered with insurance in the Build Back Better scheme, or is that outside of the Build Back Better scheme?
Well, first of all, the actual buildings don't fall into the Build Back Better scheme because it's commercial insurance for somebody's financial gain. But your contents can certainly be insured by the Flood Re scheme, but Build Back Better will not be covered as part of the fabric of the house because that doesn't fall under the Flood Re scheme. But it's certainly worth talking to your landlord and saying, look, this area is at high risk of flooding and we've got paving slabs absolutely everywhere. How about pulling some of them up and replacing them with gravel, or do some planting, water thirsty plants. Look up rain gardens. There's so much that you can plant that will absorb water. So it's just a little bit of everything can make a huge improvement to people's flood risk.
Mary, I think earlier you mentioned you'd spoken to about 2,000 renters in flood risk situations. Of the ones you spoke to, did many of them have contents insurance, or was that more rare than it was common?
Most of them did have contents insurance. There was a few out of those 2,000 people that didn't have contents insurance, but most of them did have contents insurance, which was something that shocked me actually.
My experience is that, because I rent, that's the joy I rent, and I noticed in the past couple of years that when you start renting, they actually push you to get contents insurance. Like, it wasn't something I already thought about, and then the landlords and the tenancy agencies was asking me to get it and asking for proof of it, which I wasn't sure if legally I had to, but they wanted to know that I had it.
I think that's very reassuring that landlords are asking for that, because for not very much money, especially through the Flood Re scheme, for contents, it gives you peace of mind that your sofa can be replaced, or your bed even, etc. So it is money really well worth spending.
And what is the Flood Re scheme?
Well, Flood Re scheme is a unique partnership actually between government and the insurance industry, and it came about it was launched in 2015 because prior to that many people were really struggling to get their flood insurance, and if they did get flood insurance they found that their excesses, which is the bit we all have to pay up front, had gone up hugely, and some people were saying their excesses were between £20,000 and £30,000. And if you did get flood insurance, it was very, very expensive. So the insurance industry and the government worked together to bring in Flood Re, which will guarantee flood insurance to people who live in their own homes, and it's charged according to their council tax banding, so to make it affordable and available for people, and it will insure people that are in rented properties just for their contents only. But if you want to find out any more about Flood Re, just go to their website, floodre.co.uk. All the details of Flood Re are there. And in fact, they're also on my own website. I forget that. I've got a Flood Re button on floodmary.com.
And Craig, I don't know if you have any advice when it comes to talking to your landlord. So if you've been flooded and you realise that actually there are all these things that could be done at a property level, so what Mary mentioned, the kitchens that are kitted out to withstand flooding, flood doors, for example, is there a way that you should go about these conversations with a landlord?
Usually when speaking with a landlord, if you're looking for changes that aren't statutory or an obligation on their behalf, the best way is to have an in-person conversation with them. Not always the easiest thing to arrange, so the telephone is sort of second best. But what we always recommend is that any conversation that you do have with your landlord, you back that up in written correspondence, so perhaps an email's most convenient these days, but just summarise what was discussed, keep a note of the date and things of this nature, so if these issues recur in the future, you have an evidence trail, you have a means to forward any issues that might arise from, say, repairs that haven't quite taken hold. So we always recommend make sure you get that down in writing, because if you find yourself in a court scenario for one reason or another, these are always the things that we fall back on in order to take the case for the tenant forward.
Mary, you might have found in the conversations you've had, is there any guidance that you've given when it comes to working with the landlords on issues?
First of all, if the landlord's just not interested at all, there are some temporary flood barriers that don't have any fixtures or fittings that you can fit just in front of your front door, provided there's enough brickwork for you to put it onto. There are sort of two barriers that spring to mind, that you either use a car jack to extend it, or another one that it's already got in its sort of built-in expanding system, and you can put those up yourself. They don't cost that much money. They are the cheaper end because they haven't got fixtures and fittings, but you could put those on yourself, and when the flood water's gone you can then put it into a shed or something and make sure you've cleaned it and use it for next time. But it's really, really important that if you've got the money that you actually use them if your landlord isn't interested, because it would just give you that peace of mind. Even though you've got flood barriers and maybe you've put the aluminium tape, flood water may come through the brickwork, may come from underneath, but it will reduce the amount of flood water that you've got.
It's really important what Mary said about them being temporary measures that aren't sort of making any structural changes to the property. Just as a word of caution, if you do find yourself making any significant adjustments to the property in that way, you are most likely falling foul of your tenancy agreement, and you can open yourself up to forms of litigation with your landlord. So just backing up what Mary said, anything temporary, non-structural would be a good idea.
Mary, have you ever supported someone in conversations with their landlord in order to try and get things changed if they know that it really would benefit with a flood door or something like that? Are there any key talking points that you could use?
The key talking points really would be that by making property flood resilience measures, including incorporating them into the building, will actually reduce the amount of money the landlord has got to pay when he's having to do the repairs. It's a known fact really that if you've got property flood resilience measures, particularly in surface water flooding, you can get no flooding into the property at all, no flood water. It would save an awful lot of money for the landlord. So really it would be a win for the landlord and a win for the person living in it, that he hasn't got to pay for any building works, repair works afterwards, and the person living in it isn't forced out of their home whilst all the repair works are done. And let's face it, some of the repair works are pretty extensive. If there's a deep flood, the average person's out of their home for 9 months. And having to move out and find somewhere for 9 months in a rented property would reduce the amount of income the landlord is getting in. So again, it's money well spent for him or her.
If you visit citizensadvice.org.uk, we have lots of template letters on there. So if you were to go on there and find a template around talking to your landlord about repairs, it sort of generates questions for you to answer, so you can just input your specific circumstances. So if you've gone onto one of Mary's resource pages and you've looked up about these potential options for securing the property, you could include them into the template and it will just give you sort of a formalised way of doing it, so you can feel a bit more at ease about communicating with your landlord, because I think for a lot of people that can be quite intimidating, because whether it's the truth or not, there's all sorts of tenant protections. You always feel a little bit at risk if you're trying to take on your landlord. So having these standardised ways of communicating can take out some of that anxiety.
I do feel like, again, as someone who rents, there's always the loom of like, you can be evicted for no fault eviction. So it's sort of like, oh yeah, they might not say it's because you've asked for something, but you always feel like if you ever push a bit too hard, the no fault eviction is just sort of hanging over your head, which can be quite tricky. So yeah, I should probably look up some of the templates that you offer.
Absolutely, and if you do find yourself served with a section notice to have you removed from the property, as it were, definitely get in touch with your local Citizens Advice if you think there's something wrong going on there. We can talk people through challenging the legitimacy of the section notice at all, and then even if it is a legitimate section notice, we can talk to you about your options moving on from there. Obviously that's quite an interesting area to see what the government ends up doing with this around the renters' rights, which would take some of these things away. You would still have Section 8 notice, which is for non-payment of rent, which in principle could be misused, but again, if you talk to your local advice agency, probably a Citizens Advice, they'd be able to support you with that as well in the future, even when the rules change.
And on the flip side, because as Mary said, sometimes you can be out of your house for up to 9 months. If you're locked in a tenancy, can you use the house being unlivable to get out of a tenancy early, or would you still have to remain in that tenancy if they're doing repairs over that 9 months?
So you would still be tied into the tenancy agreement. If you have a read through, which everyone should before they sign, I know that sounds a little obvious, but we do talk to people who haven't for one reason or another. And to be honest, sometimes we end up finding that individuals haven't read their tenancy agreement because they're not literate, but they haven't felt confident about talking about that. So if you are one of those people who finds yourself in that position, come to a Citizens Advice. No judgment will be in your direction from us. Just tell us what the situation is. We can read it through with you and talk to you about your rights and responsibilities. But unfortunately, in the situation of flooding, you could come to an informal arrangement with your landlord and have that written down and then signed to allow you to break from the property. But it really does come down to the contract that you've signed up to. So have a really thorough read, because you could potentially have a break clause in there, which would enable you to vacate the premises and remove your obligation to pay rent. But if you don't have one of those in, you remain locked into that legal agreement, which is why when I say if you're looking to have to vacate the property during repairs, you must get confirmation in writing following a discussion with your landlord about what the commitments you have to paying your rent, whether you're continuing to pay it at full price, a discounted price, or not at all, and instead only paying for your temporary accommodation. I would just add on this one that if you're having that conversation with your landlord and you find that they are just completely unwilling and they're not even engaging on the conversation, or you feel they're not being reasonable when you have them engaged, you may then have to take them to court. So these things, there is a route if you like to challenge the lack of engagement or the unfair decision making, it's typically through the county court if they refuse to waive or reduce the rent on your usual home or help you with the temporary accommodation. And what a court can do is order your landlord to reduce your rent for the period that you're unable to live in it, or award you compensation for things like inconvenience and distress. The amount of reduction is obviously done on a case-by-case basis, so how bad the damage is, how long the repair will take, and any sort of unforeseen factors. So I think Mary talked quite powerfully there about what it can mean to lose something that you have such visceral emotional attachments to. That's something the court can also take into consideration. So if you find yourself in one of those predicaments, a citizen's advice can give you some advice and support. They'll take you to a certain point, but you may find yourself in need of legal support via a solicitor. Citizens advice can help you with that as well by finding you solicitors that are either cheap, offer free sessions, or enable you to access legal aid, which is quite limited nowadays, but we'll always do a check with you. And very lastly, in some instances, we can refer you on to organisations like the Free Representation Unit. So these are barristers and solicitors who take on pro bono cases, but in those instances, they do usually need a lot of advance notice. So whether it comes to getting the alerts on your phone, fortifying your home, talking to your landlord, notifying the DWP, whatever it might be, the key is communicate it early, communicate it often, and communicate it with an evidence trail for future reference.
We've got to remember that council tax does come into that as well. And one thing that I was regularly told when I was travelling around the country is that people are having to pay council tax on their flooded home and on their rented home. And that can cause and has caused huge financial hardship. Now, if there's a wide-scale flood, not just in an area, but it might be all over the country, the government will often bring in a wave of council tax reduction or even stopping it via your local authority. But in a local flood, you still have to pay both. Now, if you get absolutely stuffed, as I sent many people back to the council to actually try and make face-to-face appointments to actually explain the situation that they were in, and they were really struggling to pay 2 lots of council tax in addition to the rent. So that's something else to take into consideration. Being flooded is not fun, I tell you.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of paperwork and difficulty that already you've had quite a traumatic experience and then you have to go through a lot more after it, which again is why I think the key advice is always be prepared beforehand. Another key point based on something you said before, Craig. So when you say don't vacate your house, I'm assuming you mean like officially don't move into somewhere else. But obviously a flood can come so quickly that you might need to vacate from a safety perspective. In those instances, I'm assuming that is absolutely fine that you're evacuating, and that doesn't count as you like sort of vacating the property.
Yeah, so when I said vacate the property, what I really meant was to abandon your tenancy. So don't leave the property and stop paying your rent and imagine that your obligation has gone away. Contracts are quite brutal like that. If it's a safety issue, you need to leave and get yourself, your children, pets even, to a safe scenario. But yeah, you are still contractually bound, unfortunately.
And that is where a grab bag, actually packing an emergency grab bag in advance and keeping it on top of your wardrobe. So if you do have to leave your home in a hurry, that you've got everything that you need, especially if you've got young children, sort of babies' nappies. If you're ill, you've got a spare prescription, everything that you need to function for the next couple of days in that bag. So that's something else that will be on your to-do list. And on my website, I've got some advice as to what to put in to your grab bag as well, because if you need to evacuate the property, you need to take things with you to help you survive for the next few days. That's absolutely essential too.
There's also on your website, I think also on the government website, there is an example of a emergency flood plan, a to-do list, that so you don't even have to think of all of this yourself. You don't have to listen to this episode and think, oh, I need to remember everything that they've said I have to do. All of that will be on a template pre-made that you just go through and you fill in everything.
Yeah, that's true, because every house is different. Every household has different needs. And so the flood to-do list is bespoke just to your house, where you live. and you.
And I think something you said earlier, I really want to focus on, of a good relationship with neighbours, with friends, so that if something happens, again, you've already got that link to people who you know can support you, and also potentially who you can be supporting as well.
And also from a non-selfish point of view, if you've got an elderly neighbour, just make sure they're all right as well. And also young single mums with young children, or people with disabled children. I had a disabled child when I was flooded, and trying to deal with him and his severe autism and being flooded was really awful. So really just try and get to know all your neighbours and look after each other. And one thing that did happen when I flooded is, for the first time ever, I'd got to know all my neighbours really well and made a new cohort of really good friends that did support us. We did support each other come the next flood, and yes, there was one. So flood often isn't just a one-off, it can be more than one-off. And that's why property flood resilience is so important.
I know in the north of the county in Buckingham, there's a group that has started up as well, so I think those support groups are particularly important. I think they're called Flood Action for Buckingham, and there are a number of businesses in particular that have come together who are subject to flooding on a recurrent basis, so they talk to the community about all sorts of actions that could be taken and do things like go around taking leaves from drains and sticks that are clogged and things of this nature to try and improve the situation. And I think that's a really lovely way for people to sort of help their community generally, but I personally have never been sort of flooded in a property, but I can imagine just having that support network of friends after the fact even is just a lovely thing to have, people understanding the situation you've been through. Because I think if you've lost something particularly near and dear to you in that kind of scenario, it may be hard for some people to relate to you, but if they've been through the exact same thing, that must be a hell of a lot of comfort, I would have thought.
Absolutely. Flood action groups and flood wardens are the salt of the community when a flood occurs. Flood action groups know everybody and can help communities prepare for flooding as well, and be the voice of the community with those that manage flood risk, local authority and the Environment Agency. And flood wardens will be there to support you if there is a flood. Quite often they go knocking doors to make sure people know a flood is imminent. So they really are vital. And I have to tell you as well, on a personal note, I met my best friend. I didn't know her then, but she did knock my door, waded through the flood water to say, look, I haven't got the use of a toilet. Where can I go? And as I was just about to leave myself to go to the local Tesco to use their facilities, we went together. So the flood isn't all bad. It's absolutely devastating. But one thing it can do is draw the community together and give you a new best friend.
We can always find some positive in what mostly is quite a horrible experience. And I think there's some stats out there to do with what it's like to be flooded, but I do think sometimes there's a real focus on property damage and the cost of flooding. But I think you speaking earlier, Mary, this is the first time I've really heard someone talk about actually it wasn't the most expensive things being lost that hurt the most. It was the small things, the sentimental things that can't be replaced. I've got clothes from my grandparents that I love, and that I was devastated when my friend accidentally put it in the wash and it got ruined. And it wasn't because it had a high cost, but because actually it is irreplaceable. And it's something that really people don't speak about. And so if you have those friends, they can understand you and they can know that actually it is a really big deal to lose something that sure might not be very expensive, but isn't a replaceable item to you.
Yes, and go somewhere and have a coffee and talk through what's going on, because one thing we haven't really talked about is the mental health impact of being flooded, and it is hugely traumatic having your home violated by filthy, stinking floodwater. But going out with your new friends somewhere dry for a coffee and just sharing your experience really, really does help to reduce that emotional impact, knowing that somebody totally gets what you're going through.
Yeah, and I think even if you move into an area that you've discovered is at flood risk but you've never flooded and you don't know, ask around, talk to neighbours. Finding facilities is a great example, Mary. That's not something you might know before the flood, and then you realise you can't use your bathroom, you can't shower, but your neighbours might know where to go and you might make a friend as well. So is there anything either of you think that we've not covered when it comes to very specifically rented accommodation and flood risk that we should talk about?
For those people who don't have contents insurance, maybe because they have an older tenancy or perhaps they couldn't afford the payments towards it, there are options from your local council. So I know within Buckinghamshire, for example, it's called the Helping Hand Team, and one of the things that they can support with is the replacement of white goods. You know, your washing machine, your cooker has gone out of action because perhaps the flooding caught you off guard. This is one of those things that could help you in order to replace them. They are often means tested, so they're likely to ask you a lot of questions about your financial circumstances, but at the end of it you could be able to get access to that. And also getting in touch with your citizens' advice around income maximisation. Maybe you're not on benefits, so you don't have to be, but there could be grants that exist out there. I know there's all sorts of strange ones that exist. So if you were a teacher, specifically of geography, between the years 1980 and 1997, sometimes they get this specific. There could be a fund available to you of, £200 to £300, which, particularly if you're on a low income, or even if you're not, that can go a long way to replacing beds, making sure that you've got a cooker or a microwave available to feed your children. Just reaching out, seeing what kinds of support. You don't necessarily have to come to citizens' advice, but have a good Google of welfare support that's available in your area. You never know what you might find. And this is completely off-piste, I suppose, but if you're having a look at things like Gumtree and Facebook Marketplace, often people will list things for free. All that needs to happen is that they need to be collected. So if you're really hard up to replace furniture and things of that nature, because you're waiting on payments to come through, or you're just stuck on a fixed income, having a look at those kinds of things might make your life a little bit more manageable as you try and rebuild.
Amazing. So, thank you both very much for being here today, and thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. Please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising, or would you like to join me to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. That's all for now. We will be back on the last Thursday of next month with another episode of Groundwater Rising.